Thank you, Connie, very much for that. I hope you all are having a joyous Christmas. I certainly.
Christmas.
Try Easter.
That's a good way to start off.
Time passes so fast. I went to the Good Friday service here. I've gone for a quarter of a century. I've never missed. That service is just a blockbuster.
The Tenebrae.
And the Tenebrae service cannot be improved on, except for one thing. For many years, Brian Rafferty would play Schindler's List. And I was just a puddle on the floor every year, because his interpretation of that is deeply spiritual piece. Just knocked me over. Anyway, so that's a great start out for this time of reflection and celebration. And so now today we celebrate, we see the kids out here in the bed picking up their eggs. It's wonderful, of course. It's amazing how we never think about the word Easter, where it comes from. People use this term and realize that only in English do we say Easter, and I think in German. Otherwise, it's some variant of the word Paschal, and so on. Now, the way this happened is this. Among the many gods of the Germans, they had one they worshipped was named Ostar. Now, the month that we call April, they call Ostar month, literally. The Anglo-Saxons. Remember the word, the Anglos were one of the German tribes that came into England after the Romans left about 500 AD. And the Romans were, the Romans were very controlling, or I should say, very dominant. But when the Germans came in, they brought with them their gods. And one of those was celebrated at the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Now think about that. Vernal equinox, March 21st, first full moon, which was this past Wednesday, would have been their celebration of that particular goddess. And then the following Sunday is when we celebrate. So the Passover started Wednesday evening after the full moon had appeared on Wednesday. And so Wednesday evening, they started the celebration we know as Passover. It lasts 8 days here in America. It lasts 7 days in Israel. It is a most important celebration. What I think is fascinating, if you know where these Germanic tribes, of which the largest were the Anglos, which is, by the way, why we call it Angleland or England, right? And so the word English is what we're really saying, we're speaking the language of the Angles, which will be German. So why aren't we speaking German? Well, because of 1066, when William the Conqueror came in and told everybody they were speaking French. And the French and the German mixed together in a forced marriage that we're struggling with every day ourselves. And that is, they created what we call English. Now, all this is to make a point, and that is that their god, Ostar, had been brought to them by the Phoenicians, who came all the way up the Danube and introduced them to this god, Ostar. And Ostar was a prominent deity in the Middle East. The one that we remember is the word Esther. Esther and Ostar and Easter all the same word, you see, which is a very interesting spin on the thing. And so what happened is when these missionaries came to convert the Germans, and in one tribe they converted were the Anglos, they would say, well, when is this time that Jesus is resurrected? And they told them, it's the first full moon after the vernal equinox. They said, oh, wow, that's when we worship Easter. Oh, okay. So they just called it, to this day, Easter time. If you think about it, it's ironic that Easter time, the time of the word, her name meant the dawn. And of course, when we think of Easter, we think of the dawn, that the resurrection has taken place. And so it is that words, each and every word in the English language, have a history. Some of them are more interesting than others. We'll wait for some folks to get in here. Your seats are still warm, Claire. Up here. Oh, you're going to bail out back there?
You want to sit up
Yeah, that way.
We saved this for you, Claire.
Okay.
Thank you.
That way we can.
You're welcome.
You can do your job more closely. Right? Okay, so that's the story of Easter, right? I mean, it's a strange story, but it's interesting. Now, last week we were talking about the city. I was focused on Jerusalem and its temple. The whole point of this series is to talk about how cities influence Christianity in a variety of different ways. And so the one we were talking about last week was Jerusalem and the temple there. Now the temple there's a particular ritual that they had, only about once every 100 years, that goes to the heart of the concept of holiness. They were completely obsessed that the temple and everything about it and everybody related to it was holy. Well, how do you make a person that becomes unholy? Let me give you an example. If a priest was working in the temple and one drop of blood dropped on the vestment, he's ritually unclean. And so how do you get rid of that ritual uncleanliness? You get rid of it by something called the ashes of the red heifer. Now, I'm going to have to jump down an Easter rabbit hole here for just a minute to explain this, okay? About 100 years, they would search for, in the land of Israel, and this is during the temple times. Now, remember, the temple lasted about 1,000 years. So, according to Josephus, the historian, the Jewish historian, he said that over the course of the temple, there were 9 red heifers. 9. Well, this seems like, how could you have enough ashes for a red heifer to last 100 years? I will try to explain what I think is the way it happened, right? So there was a lot of ritual with this. They would go over to the Mount of Olives. And in the Mount of Olives, they would sacrifice a red heifer. Now this heifer had to be so red, if it had more than 2 hairs of white out, could not be used for this ritual. So they would make a fire of sacred wood, probably cedar. Acacia was always often used, a wood that they considered holier. By the way, the temple itself was lined with the cedars of Lebanon. Why? Well, because they will repel insects. And moth. See, because remember, in the temple you could have nothing dead. You couldn't even have a garden near the temple. If you lived near the temple and had a garden and you were burning some of your leaves or things, vegetables, and so on, it might bring smoke into the temple. See? And this was not good. This was not official smoke. You see, this was illegal smoke. So they were that particular, right? So they had cedar because cedar could not be invaded by insects. So if you had walked into the temple back then, the smell would probably knock you out, right? Of the smell of cedar wood. And we know that the cherubim that were around the Ark of the Covenant were made of acacia wood. And acacia wood also is impervious to rotting. And in America we have redwood, right, which is still popular to this day. Now, what they did with the ashes of the red heifer, they used this wood that was considered quote-unquote holy wood, and they'd make a fire, and they put the red heifer on it after they had sacrificially cut its throat in what we would call today the kosher manner. And that animal would then be sacrificed. And a heifer, for us folk that didn't grow up on the farm, is female bovine, about 1 year, who's never had calves. If she had calves, she'd be a cow. But again, in human terms, we say virgin, right? So again, always, when it comes to holiness, for some reason, virginity is really important. So you have to have the red. And why red? Anybody want to take a shot at this, Richard? Yeah. Red. Why a red heifer? Why not a green heifer? Well,
red for blood?
Yeah, that's the assumption, red for blood. Okay. You always have this theme of blood through all of the whole business of atonement. Because if you think about it, every day at the temple they're sacrificing animals. They're sacrificing birds, and they're sacrificing sheep and goats, and even bulls. So if you're rich and have a lot of sin, then you sacrifice a bull, right? There's a Greek term called hecatomb. Hecatomb is when you sacrifice 100 bulls. So that's a big deal. In the Iliad, the Greeks have to sacrifice 100 bulls to the god Apollo, who brought the plague on them. And that's how one of the ways they got out of the plague. 100 bulls. But there's some good news here. They can then have a barbecue, right? Bulls. So they would enjoy eating it. And 100 bulls are going to feed a lot.
That's a lot.
But why bulls? Well, because bulls, for every heifer you can have, for every 10 heifers you can have 1 bull or something like that. So anyway, hard for me to finish my story on the ashes here. So the ashes are burned, and there's a big pile. A heifer, even in 1 year, is pretty big, right? So there's a lot of ashes, about maybe more than half wood ashes. It gets all mixed up together. And then what I think happened is I think they pounded it down into a powder. And so they might have a little thimbleful. Then what you had to have is ceremonial jars. Now let me explain ceremonial jars. According to the Old Testament, in order to have a ceremonial jar, it's a container that has to be cut out of rock. It has to be cut out of rock. And being cut out of rock can be made of pottery, right? It has to be made out of native rock. And then it has to be into it. You have to pour living water, which is the water out of a spring or water that's moving, not stagnant water, right? Again, all part of the holiness thing. And so they fill these ceremonial jars, and my guess is they just take a little speck, like this, put it in, mix it up, right? It's a trace. It reminds me of Coca-Cola. Did you know that Coca-Cola still has coca leaf in it to this day? Coca-Cola has a contract with a company that does extract of coca. Now we know that as cocaine. And but it's so diluted. You know, 1 part per trillion, right? And that's how they can still call it Coca-Cola. And the kids are coming, so all eyes are yeah. Very symbolic why the egg and chicken and rabbit are so important part of Easter has to do with the god Estor. See, they were used to having kind of a celebration. You know, kids would go out and get some eggs, and then they would color them. And it just goes way back. And everybody enjoyed hunting for eggs. Remember, before chicken coops, where were the chickens? They're out in the bushes, right, on a farm, and then you go find them. There might be people in this room who actually grew up on a farm and had to go out and find the eggs. Charles, were you one of those?
I've never done that.
Yeah.
Jan's done that.
Jan, you've done it? Max, you've done it?
I've done that.
Yeah. So, our children these days don't often get the opportunity to go find eggs. But, you know, it's kind of a treasure hunt in a way. Now, I thought, boy, there's a million eggs out there. They will never have it, and they'll pick that place clean and do it with great energy. I noticed that baskets get bigger as the years go by.
Grandchild.
Yeah. So here's all of this to explain 2 things. Number 1 thing is that if you had some clothes that had been some blood had got on it, which is ironic itself, because think about it. The blood is for the atonement, and yet the blood makes you ritually unclean. Figure that one out, right? But we have a lot of ironies in our life, and that's one of them. So they would then take some of that water from these bowls, these containers, these rock pots, we'll say, and they would then, when they use the rock pot, but they would never take all the water, because there's a trace element of the red heifer. They'd fill it back up again, and then use it, pour some of it, clean the clothes off, and ritually clean. Now, does anybody know what happened in the New Testament when Jesus performed his first miracle? He's at the wedding at Cana, and there's this really interesting story. It's almost like a joke in a way, because here's what happens. So they run at the wedding, they're all having a good time, they run out of wine. And somebody asked Jesus' mother about this, and he asked him. And so Jesus says, get the ritual jars. Get it? Get the ritual jars. What's that all about? Fill them up with water. And then it transformed into wine. Now, we read that. A lot of people just read that as a miracle, water to wine. But if you understand the ashes of the red heifer, this is purified water. See? But the Roman Catholics call holy water. This is holy water that then is turned into wine. I mean, it's all symbolic, right? Nothing is accidental. Things that Jesus do, things in the New Testament that we don't really understand the total depth of it. This is a perfect example of it. So the ashes red heifer would be distributed throughout the countryside, and that person who was having the wedding had some of those ritual jars with a little trace of it. And it's kind of ironic. Somebody comes from the audience to the father of the bride, who I presume is putting on the wedding, and says, "What are you doing? You give us this, middle grade wine, and then the really good stuff you give at the end." and then, of course, the really good stuff was the stuff Jesus had turned into wine. People, just kind of flies over. And in my own life, I think about this. So many things that I've read 100 times just fly over the top, right? And then later I'll read it and I'll see, oh, I get it finally. Like, why were the shepherds the first ones to see Jesus? You'd think that somebody call up, some important city people to come and say, why were the shepherds? Why did the angels appear to the shepherds? What are the shepherds doing? They're raising lambs. But they're raising, remember I told you last time, Josephus said at one Passover they had 250,000 lambs, right? 250,000 lambs. They got to raise a lot of lambs, right? They're raising sanctuary lambs. This is only 5 miles from Jerusalem, right? The point's being made there is Jesus will become a lamb. Okay? In Latin, Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, that takes away the sin of the world. In other words, the blood of the Lamb, Jesus becomes the Lamb. But from the very beginning, Jesus is the Lamb. You see that symbolism. All right, all of that just to finish last week. Okay, so we're going to talk about, I'd hope to talk about 2 cities today. I'll probably only get one block of one city, but I'll do my best. So I want to talk to you about a nearby city from Jerusalem, and that is the city of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria actually plays a huge role in church history. I explain it this way. First of all, missionaries went out, apostles went out, and people started becoming Christians. Mark went to Egypt, and there Egypt became the first Christian country in the world. And it's forgotten mainly because later in the 7th century, Egypt is invaded by the Arabs who are Muslim, and the country becomes primarily Muslim, although there still is a Christian community there in Egypt. Now, Egypt, Alexandria is there because of the most extraordinary individual, one of the most extraordinary individuals in all of history, of course, and that's Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a very young man when he started out to conquer the East. And Alexander had one of the best teachers anybody can have. Does anybody know who was the tutor?
Aristotle.
Thank you, Richard. Aristotle. How about that for credentials? Who was your teacher? Aristotle. Not bad. So Aristotle taught him what we call natural science. And later, when Alexander the Great goes on his trip, he collects specimens for Aristotle. The real father of natural science, I believe, is Aristotle. And this is one of the things, he was always collecting things, always interested in the culture. This very young man who is extraordinary in what he accomplished, he founded 72 cities. And they're all named, they all have the same name originally. You know what? Alexandria. Every city was called Alexandria something. But the one in Egypt is the one everybody remembers because it became, for a while, for about 200 years, the center of the universe in terms of knowledge, learning, and culture. Because there, in that city, the Greeks built the greatest library of all time, called the Library of Alexandria. And it had no peer. Everything was collected. The only library, even today, that can be compared to it is the Library of Congress. Library of Congress is such an extraordinary institution that if you haven't been there, you'll be blown away, right? I was up there running a conference a number of times, and in one of the rooms they have all of Thomas Jefferson's books, which was the foundation of the Library of Congress, right? And so it seems unbelievable, right? But you can check out as a reference. I mean, you have to sit there, but you can check out any of his books. So I was looking, he had this little teeny book on something, and I thought, you could barely read the book. And in the margins, it's all this little teeny writing that I'm looking at. Oh, I don't think I could read that. I could just barely make some of it out. It was beautifully written, but just teeny. So I asked the librarian who was around there, I said, who wrote in the book here? In one of Jefferson's books, somebody wrote? He said, well, yeah, Jefferson. I was reading Jefferson's notes in the book. Unbelievable, right? And there it is. Well, anyway, the Alexandria Library was one of the great centers of learning, and then has always been kind of seen as an example of what you can do, what a place of learning could really be. So anyway, when Alexander died, his kingdom, which stretched from India to virtually Rome, he divided it up. And the prize, though, was considered Egypt, because Egypt is so rich in resources. You could grow anything in Egypt. And it was given to one of his top generals named Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy then came and ruled, and then so became a monarchy. So his sons and daughter ruled Egypt until the Romans took it over just before the time of Christ. Conquered by what Roman? Anybody?
Jews, Athens.
That's true. And by the way, Julius Caesar is remembered in the medical world for what term?
Caesarean
section, because according to the legend, the first person delivered by Caesarean section was Julius Caesar. But as with all things in English that we use commonly, this gets shortened to C. So in the hospital they'll say she has to have a C-section. And hardly anybody knows Caesarean section. But that's the legend that goes with it. Oh, by the way, Julius Caesar had a child with the last ruler, the last Greek ruler of Egypt, the last Ptolemy. Anybody but Richard want to take a shot at that? You all know. You all know. Who?
Cleopatra.
That's right. Very good. So Cleopatra is the last Ptolemy. But the Ptolemy that came, the son, his name is, they were all Ptolemies, so they give him Ptolemy Cleopatra, for example. So this is Ptolemy Soter. That's your Latin. Soter, besides Richard. No? Soter? Savior. Savior. If you go to the seminary, many seminaries require their students to take the course in soteriology, study of salvation, soteriology. And so Ptolemy Soter was a very important man in terms of Judaism and Christianity. Let me tell you why. Ptolemy Soter was a very brilliant guy. He's of course, the one who builds up the library in Alexandria, starts collecting all these things from all over the world. This continued on for about 200 years, down to Cleopatra. But anyway, he had this, he wanted desperately to be able to read the Old Testament, the Tanakh. But he couldn't read Hebrew, so he wanted to have it for his library so people could come and enjoy it. So he hired 70 translators, and those 70 translators you know, the word 7, September, I wonder why it's called 7. But we think of it as the 9th month, right? Because the Romans had started the year originally in March 1st. And they only had 10 months. And then they had this dark period of January, February. No name originally. And so Sept was the 7th month. So the first month, March, was month number 1, number 2, number 3. Then they started naming them after gods. They named March because after Mars, the god of war, because this is the month that the men went off to war. Right? They would march off to war. In fact, the word March, comes from Mars, the god Mars. Martial law, all of those words come from Mars. Sept, 7, the 7th month, was one of 4 that never got changed. They eventually named, of the 10, they named 6. But the last 2 are interesting that they named. They named her after people. People. Months should be after gods, right? Or after something important. People. The month of July. Julius Caesar again. Right? And the month of August. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, better known as Octavius. But he changed his name to Caesar Augustus. And the decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be Roman. Okay? So now you can date Christianity to the first Roman emperor. That makes it really convenient. So the 7th month. So you see the 7 in here. Septua, and then Gent means to write, or to, that's not quite right. The 70 ones who did the writing or did the translating. So 70 translators took the Greek Old Testament, the Roman Old Testament, particularly the Torah, the first 5 books, and translated them into Greek. But not the Greek of Athens, the Greek of Alexander the Great's world, and this is called Koinonia, which is your more standard Greek that's used out in the Greek world. It's like the difference, there's the Queen's English, right? Then there's American, right? The Queen's English is very proper. American, and everybody can just talk however they want to, and throw in any word you want. any slang and expression. Not the Queen's English. No, 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 no. Go over to the Episcopal Church of the Incarnation this morning for Easter. Listen to the pastor, or the pastor, boy, they never say pastor. They would say the Right Reverend Rector. Claire knows, she was raised Episcopalian. And you were too. We got two heretics in here.
But we love them.
Yeah, you can't help but love them. And so we let them stay. Anyway.
Where do you think Methodism came out?
Yeah, well, Methodism is, I used to, when I was a kid, they always talk about low church. What is low church? Lack of ceremony, more common, more everyday, right? So Methodism is a halfway house, right? You want the very low church, you go over to the Baptist. You want kind of middle of the road, Methodist. You want high church, virtually Roman Catholic in terms of ceremony, you go to the Episcopalian. And anyway, so the Septuagint. Now, finally I'm coming to the punchline, right? The cliffhanger answer. And that is, so why is the Septuagint that big a deal? Two reasons. Number one, it introduced the Greek world, which is a big world now because of Alexander the Great, to the Old Testament. The story of the Old Testament brought, and the promise of the Messiah. Very, very important. But in my opinion, this is the really important thing. When Jesus quotes the Old Testament, he does not quote it from the Hebrew. He quotes it directly from the Septuagint. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, because when you translate, there are certain idioms that change. And those are the idioms that Jesus uses when he is often referencing the Old Testament. But you think he would go to the Hebrew and then but the only time Jesus goes out of the Greek is when he's on the cross. And he uses his Aramaic. And as we talked about last time, Aramaic came with the two tribes that were allowed to come back from Babylon, where they were speaking, where they had already learned how to speak Aramaic. And so three languages are mixed up here. Jesus spoke Aramaic. He knew Hebrew. He could read it for sure. I'm sure he could speak it to a degree. And then Greek, right? So Sermon on the Mount, was it given in Greek? I mean, who knows for sure? Then Greek. Anyway, so the Septuagint plays a big role in the evolution of Christianity. Because when Christianity moved around, people had read. The Greek world knew about the Old Testament because they read it in Greek. And then the New Testament, of course, is entirely in Koine, Greek, with, I think, maybe just a little exception here and there. All right, now, I'm going to talk next week about the city of Constantinople. Now, that's a story. So I hope you're able to find a few minutes to come and hear that story. Thank you for having me.